I was the logistics person, the liaison person for logistics with the coalition forces. I was actually based at Incirlik Air Base. It was a tremendous experience. We had the support of 11 militaries who wanted to go home, of course, but they were doing something they had never done before. Their primary focus was humanitarian and also security. It was their job to provide security to a piece of Iraq from where virtually all of the refugees in Turkey came from. And that was mostly Duhok, the province of Duhok. So they essentially urged the Iraqi security forces to get out of town, and so that the people would get out of the mountains. It was a horrendous situation in the mountains of Turkey. There were 8 camps. People just ran to the camps, fearing chemical weapons. They drove as far as they could. It was winter, with young children and elderly people, abandoned their cars and walked. They had nothing. And it was cold and wet. They essentially ran out of town. What happened in April, I mean, all this happened in like March. There was the collapse of the uprising. Initially, the Kurdish uprising was very successful, but then it collapsed and people feared the worst and they ran to the mountains. And estimated maybe 750,000 ran to the mountains of Turkey, and maybe another million ran into Iran. So with United Nations Security Council 688, which imposed on the government of Iraq a humanitarian focus, they had to cooperate. Without going into details why, but they did cooperate. They essentially threw open their doors to UN agencies and international NGOs. Many just drove right into Baghdad and went about their business doing good things to the extent that they could. And the world just poured its heart out and poured its pocketbooks out. We were inundated with materials. And that was my job, getting some of that was air freighted into Turkey, down into northern Iraq, into the Kurdistan part. And we had all sorts of things. Because of the images of winter, of people suffering in the mountains during winter, we had a tremendous amount of winter clothing, more than we could actually handle properly. Of course, much of it arrived after winter was over, but we did get some very useful material in time. We got Norwegian military winter tents. We've got Czechoslovakian military warm boots. We got hundreds of Korean War vintage casualty bags, which could open up like, they were like quilts on a bed with fur-lined hoods. They must have been just left over from the Korean War. We had, I can remember some figures, 285,000 pairs of Korean War vintage woolen serge trousers. Excellent condition, size small. We had jackets, we had just a lot. With 11 militaries, there's the usual ones, but there was also Luxembourg and a few others that you might not normally anticipate. It was in a way a pleasure working with them because they had the logistics capabilities and they had the skills. And of course, they wanted to go home, so they were very supportive of the UN. Now, let's just very briefly point out that the UN is not really set up to jump into an emergency at a moment's notice. When an emergency happens, when it occurs, they have to go scrounging around for people. They have to rob agencies. People who are already very much involved in doing what they're doing. and then they have to go find other people. They may have a few key leaders to set things up, but everything is pretty much from scratch, and there are no teams readily available to go out and do this thing. What happened was there are many UN agencies. There's a UN agency for everything. There's even a UN agency for outer space affairs. What happened was they assigned the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This is the UNHCR. It's more commonly known as the UN Refugee Agency. They assigned them to be the lead agency. They could do everything. So UNHCR, I was asked, I came in, I was with UNHCR. We handled everything. As time went on, we assisted people to go back to their homes.